If you want to send in a topic idea, you can either put it on our Twitter feed at CSPANWJ or send an email to journal@cspan.org. The House is coming into session. This is live coverage, and they will be voting on health care repeal today.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., May 16, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Vicky Hartzler to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip, limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a week after the President extolled the benign virtues of big government and told university students to ignore those who warn of its dangers, Americans woke up to headlines that this government has been targeting groups and individuals that it doesn't like for intimidation and harassment. Now, I appreciate the President's sudden interest in getting to the bottom of this. But I must remind the House that more than a year ago, I and other members rose on this floor to warn of these tactics directed at Tea Party groups by the IRS. At the time, the administration responded by saying that this was just a natural backlog. Well, we now know that was a deliberate and premeditated lie. It now appears that nearly 500 conservative groups were subjected to invasive review and intimidation. The IRS demanded the names of every participant at every meeting these groups had held over a period of years, transcripts of every speech given at those meetings, what positions they'd taken on issues, the names of their volunteers and donors, and in some cases of their family members and associates, and copies of privileged communications they had had with elected officials. In some cases, the person filing the request was then subjected to a personal income tax audit. There is no way to estimate the number of additional groups that were discouraged from organizing because of these tactics. Meanwhile, it appears that leftist groups had their applications routinely approved. The impact this had on the 2012 election is incalculable. We're also learning that these tactics extended well beyond a few low-level rogue employees in Cincinnati. Lois Lerner, the official in charge of tax-exempt organizations for the IRS, was awarded more than $42,000 in bonuses while she was directing what the President now calls outrageous behavior. Highly intrusive and unwarranted demands for information also originated from the Washington, D.C. office and at least 2 satellite IRS offices in California. Dr. Ann Hendershot, a Catholic sociologist, professor, and writer, came under a personal income tax audit after she exposed a George Soros front group masquerading as a grassroots Catholic organization. She said the questions put to her during a grueling audit were largely political, and this occurred from the New Haven, Connecticut office. It appears that evangelical groups were also targeted, as were Jewish groups supporting Israel. Nor was this misconduct limited to groups applying under Section 501. There's now reason to believe that IRS officials leaked confidential tax information to top officials in the Obama campaign and to liberal groups such as ProPublica and the Huffington Post, which may then have illegally published that information. During the campaign, Austin Goolsbee and Harry Reid referenced confidential tax information involving Charles and David Koch and Mitt Romney, only to back off when they were pressed for their sources. Nor does this conduct appear to be limited to the IRS. Shortly after businessman Frank Vandersloot was attacked by the Obama campaign for his support of Mitt Romney, he came under audits by both the IRS and the Labor Department. The Competitive Enterprise Institute has just released a damning survey of fee waivers granted by the Environmental Protection Agency under the Freedom of Information Act. Left-leaning groups had their fees waived 92% of the time. Conservative groups just the opposite, about 7% of the time. And this week it also became clear that the FBI is using general warrants, banned by the Fourth Amendment, to rifle through the phone records of AP reporters with a clear intention to intimidate whistleblowers and to obstruct the operation of a free press. We are seeing a pattern of conduct throughout this administration that is absolutely toxic to a free society. Government using its powers to intimidate private citizens who are simply trying to take part in the public policy debate. Madam Speaker, this cries out for a full investigation by the Congress, and I utterly reject the notion that the ritual naming and firing of a few hapless scapegoats is sufficient. Every government employee who abused their power needs to be identified, exposed, disgraced, dismissed, and debarred from ever again holding a position of authority or trust within this government. When the Constitution was ratified by the New York Convention, Alexander Hamilton said, "Here, sir, the people govern. Here they act by their immediate representatives." Madam Speaker, the most cherished liberties of the American people are under attack, and we, their immediate representatives, have a solemn obligation to act in the defense of their freedom, their country, and their Constitution. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. A few days ago, the world passed 400 million parts per million level of carbon, higher than anything we've seen in the atmosphere for over 3 million years. This puts in stark focus on the climate crisis and the indifference we're seeing from congressional leadership on this problem. In the last 24 hours, there was all you needed to know about the state of play for climate science and dealing with global warming in 2 articles in the newspaper. Yesterday, the business section of the New York Times by Eduardo Porter discussed how the reinsurance industry is entirely comfortable with the climate science, predicting more rapid extreme weather events and dire consequences. They in the insurance industry, after all, don't have the luxury of debating science when they must deal with facts on the ground. This is a dollar and cents for a vast industry trying to help people cope with the consequences of natural disaster. As a result of the market discipline, they've had to embrace reality, accept it, and plan for it. It was poignant that Porter observed and probed their lack of engagement in government policies, at least in the United States, that would help minimize future damage. Remember, this is even as the scientists told us, we've had the highest concentration of carbon for 3 million years. In today's Washington Post, there is a front-page story about fish populations that aren't waiting for their habitat to make it impossible for them to live. Species all over the globe are moving. They're migrating to cooler climates. In a process that's been taking place for decades now, fish are sorting themselves out and leaving areas that no longer sustain their quality of life, their ability to reproduce and to thrive. They have steadily been moving to areas where the effects of climate change are not so pronounced. Isn't it interesting that fish, without fancy scientific instrumentation or computer analysis, or dare I say it, political focus groups, have reacted to facts in the sea and moved to where they can function, where they can live, where they can escape, for the time being at least, the impact of climate change. They're also escaping from the people who depend on these fish for their living in the previous habitat. But that's another story about the devastation that local communities are facing because of the climate change consequences. Isn't it time that the political process starts responding to a problem that even fish can figure out? What is it going to take for people in this body to wake up to their responsibilities and act with the same insight as aquatic species that don't have graduate degrees in computers, but mercifully for them, don't have political blinders and ideological fervor, wasting huge amounts of time on pointless activities like debating whether to repeal Obamacare for the 37th time. Hopefully, insurance companies and people who depend on these aquatic creatures will lend an air of reality to the discussion of climate change that is almost non-existent here on Capitol Hill. Maybe reaching the point where it's no longer a debate because it's really past time for a debate. It's time for us to take action like our friends in the ocean. If Charlie the tuna can figure it out, why can't the Republican leadership in Congress? Let's maybe spend a little time debating with the Safe Climate Caucus this existential crisis of climate change and global warming.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I have the distinct honor of wishing a belated happy birthday to an organization that I am a proud member of back home in Texas, 14. I want to take a moment to say thank you to the Exchange Club of Pearland, where I have been a member for a number of years. They've done a lot of good work in the community, and I look forward to the expansion of their club and the work they will continue to do to better that community. I would also like to welcome the newest chapter, Friendswood, Texas, where I currently reside. I look forward to working with them in promoting American exceptionalism and helping to serve in our community. For those of you that might not know, the National Exchange Club is a service organization with over 700 clubs and 21,000 members throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. On March 27, 2013, they celebrated their 102nd birthday. From a handful of members in Detroit, Michigan at the turn of the 20th century, Exchange has developed into an outstanding national service organization comprised of tens of thousands of men and women who serve their local communities and advance their motto of unity in service. Exchange sponsors activities are designed to benefit, award, and develop our nation's youth, promote crime prevention, serve senior citizens, and recognize military and public safety service providers. Exchange also promotes Americanism, and its national project is the Prevention of Child Abuse program. In addition to these programs, the National Exchange Club has been at the forefront of significant developments throughout American history, including the early days of aviation progress. The spirit of patriotism, along with the desire to heighten awareness of our rich religious heritage, placed Exchange in a position of leadership with other organizations that led to the addition of the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. And as Reagan said, if we ever forget we're one nation under God, we will be a nation gone under. The Exchange Club is America's service club, an organization that promotes American exceptionalism. I'm a believer in our country's exceptionalism, and I will never apologize for it. Think about this for a second, folks. When the world has a catastrophe, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a tsunami, earthquake, whatever it is, when the world has a catastrophe and dials 911, who is it that answers? It's America, isn't it? It's the red, white, and blue. It's the land of the free, the home of the brave. For a safe world, we need a strong America. For a strong America, we need a safe America. The Exchange Club works ever so hard to keep America strong and safe. So to them, I wish a very happy birthday, especially to the Pearland Club and the Friendswood Club, and I say thank you for all your hard work. I'm Randy Weber, and that's the way I see it from where I sit here in America. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the latest forecast says this year's federal deficit will shrink by 41% compared to last year. That point bears repeating. the deficit is shrinking, and dramatically, thanks to the bipartisan actions taken by this Congress earlier this year. CBO now projects that a deficit of $642 billion, $200 billion less than projected just 3 months ago, the lowest level since 2008. Just 4 years ago, the deficit was over 10% of our GDP. This year it's projected to fall below 5%, half of what it was just 4 years ago. Now, I understand that this news may not fit neatly within the narrative of our friends on the other side of the aisle, who, just as they did in the summer of 2011, unfortunately, tried just last week to manufacture yet another debt crisis where none exists. I would note that it was only a few months ago we worked together in a bipartisan fashion to suspend the debt limit. On the heels of our New Year's Day compromise and the tax portions of the fiscal cliff, my Republican colleagues recognized the dangers of yet another debt showdown on the markets and on the possibility of downgrading U.S. creditworthiness. But rather than build on that rare moment of bipartisan comedy and work with Democrats on a balanced plan to put our nation back on the path of fiscal responsibility, House Republicans doubled down. They pushed ahead with their cut spending at any cost agenda. They pushed through a continuing resolution that baked in the harmful cuts of sequestration, which is a self-inflicted wound on our economy. Ironically, House Republicans just last week pushed through on a party-line vote a bill that claims to protect the full faith and credit of the United States, when in reality it would only place it more at risk by suggesting we won't be good for our debt. And furthermore, many of my Republican colleagues have relied on this debt crisis on research done by two economists, Mr. Reinhart and Rogoff, suggesting that high levels of public debt always lead to lower rates of economic growth. That research has been the foundation of Republican austerity proposals in America, including the last three versions of the Ryan budget, which decimate public investments in our communities and the economy in the name of deficit reduction. It turns out the researchers aggregated the data incorrectly. They couldn't even read the Excel sheets properly. And that dramatically shifted the findings to show growth for high-debt countries was more than 2% higher than they said it was. And it turns out there is no magical threshold of 90% that always leads to, in fact, economic contraction. In fact, quite the opposite. Raising the debt limit is not a license to spend more money. It simply ensures that America will be good for its current debts and obligations. We've been good for that since Alexander Hamilton established the U.S. Treasury in George Washington's first cabinet. The bipartisan agreement to suspend the debt ceiling expires this weekend. But with its latest forecast, CBO now says that that limit probably won't be reached until October or November of this year. Most news reports suggest this will reduce the political pressure to achieve a bipartisan deal on further reducing the deficit in a balanced way. I'd argue the urgency still remains, and that this window of time presents us with the perfect opportunity for bipartisan negotiations to resume without the specter of the sword of Damocles of that limit over our heads immediately. I'm dismayed that my Republican friends continue to shun their own party's heritage for making strategic investments in infrastructure and innovation in favor of a blind adherence to slashing government spending with no acknowledgement for the consequences. I've consistently said that federal spending must be reduced, but I've also said that it must be done in tandem with maintaining strategic federal investments in things that create jobs like R&D, infrastructure, innovation. I'd suggest that my Republican friends look no further than the GDP growth from the last 2 quarters, showing it's not the federal debt, but their MEDAC's approach to cutting those federal investments that in fact has created what drag there is in the U.S. economy. The last time Republicans played games with the debt ceiling, we registered the lowest monthly job growth in 3 years, the stock market tumbled, and S&P, for the first time ever, downgraded U.S. debt. The latest job numbers show we've been adding 208,000 jobs a month on average since November, prompting a surge in confidence reflected by the market's climb to record levels. I implore my friends on the other side of the aisle to use this time to work with us on a balanced approach to deficit reduction and economic growth, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, it is literally lights out at our military bases. Next to me is a photo that ran the other weekend in my hometown newspaper, which shows darkened hallways at the largest Air Force base in the world, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There wasn't a lack of power at the base that day, but a lack of leadership here in Washington. The lights were out because the Senate and the President have failed to take up the issue of sequestration. Sequestration is having a devastating effect on the readiness and the morale of our service members and civilian workforce. Imagine going to work and the President feels that you are so insignificant that you don't even deserve to have the lights on. The President promised the American people during his re-election campaign that this would not happen, but it has. It's time for the President to come to the table with a solution to this issue before our military is irreparably impacted. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. By now, you've all heard of the terrible shooting that took place on Sunday during the Mother's Day parade in New Orleans. Like all Americans, I was saddened to once again see a joyous public event marred by gun violence. Yet, as the Mother's Day shooting unfolded in New Orleans, I was struck by another lesser-known story about the toll of gun violence that was playing out more than 900 miles away in Chicago. It is the story of love and loss told by the mothers of those killed by gun violence who are facing Mother's Day without their children, perhaps for the first time. A group of these mothers gathered at a memorial outside a Chicago church to mourn and to remember their children. As a mother who was blessed to spend the day with my children, their pain and anguish is unimaginable. For every mass shooting that grabs the headlines, there are dozens more that take place on America's streets every day that are leaving a lost generation in their wake. And yet, in the national debate about gun violence, these everyday killings, this slow-motion massacre, is often overlooked. And so are the mothers who are left behind. Just as the mothers who wept for their children in Newtown, these Chicago mothers are also the faces of the aftermath of gun violence. Because whether your child is shot in a classroom or on a street corner or in a park, your hopes and dreams for them were the same, and so is the agony of your loss. It is for these mothers, Clara Allen, Tanya Butler, Angela Blakely, and others like them, that I raise my voice and will continue to raise my voice in memory of their children, to implore my colleagues in Congress to pass reasonable and responsible gun legislation. We must act now to end the senseless killings in our streets, the gun violence. I know there are those who think that new gun laws aren't the solution. I say they're looking at the wrong equation. Common sense gun restrictions are a part of a multi-pronged approach to stemming gun violence that should also include increased access to mental health services and better community and social supports. It will take a village to save these children, our children. Passing common sense gun legislation is a key step in the process by helping to keep guns out of the wrong hands. We must take a stand for these children and their mothers and send the message that we hear them, we care about them, and that their lives matter. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Later on this afternoon, the House will vote for the 37th time to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, the Speaker of the House of Representatives has already been on record saying that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. And so it's just not clear to me why we are wasting the time and the treasure of the American people on another futile legislative fantasy. In fact, it's a legislative fantasy that has cost the American people more than $50 million. And if, in fact, the Affordable Care Act were to be repealed, it would do even more damage, as independent economists have estimated that a repeal would add to the federal deficit by more than $100 billion. Now, it's often been said that the classic definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, but somehow expecting a different result. Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. The Affordable Care Act was signed into law in 2010. The Supreme Court, with the Chief Justice voting in the majority, held that the Affordable Care Act was constitutional in 2012. And then a few months later, President Barack Obama was reelected in an electoral college landslide. Yet later on this afternoon, we're voting to repeal the Affordable Care Act for the 37th time, over and over and over again. It's a classic definition of legislative insanity. As if the 37th vote is going to be any different, yield any different results than the previous 36, where we've wasted the taxpayer dollars of the American people. The Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing because over the next decade, more than 30 million Americans who otherwise would not have had health care insurance will be insured. Seems to me that that's a good thing. The Affordable Care Act makes sure that insurance companies cannot deny medical coverage for pre-existing conditions. Seems to me that that's a good thing. The Affordable Care Act provides small businesses with a 35% tax credit, which will enable these small businesses to continue to grow and to flourish. Seems to me that that's a good thing. The Affordable Care Act allows young Americans who are just starting out to remain on the insurance plan of their parents until the age of 26, giving them a real chance to get themselves started in their pursuit of the American dream. I'm new, but it seems to me that that's a good thing. Yet later on this afternoon, for the 37th time, we're engaging in another futile legislative fantasy. There's a couple of other things that we could be doing. We could be dealing with the sequester, $85 billion in random cuts that are costing the economy more than 500,000 jobs, but we're not. We could be debating the American Jobs Act, trying to put the people of this great country back to work and stimulate the economy, but we're not. We could be trying to get a budget, go to conference, create some certainty for industry and the American people, but we're not. Madam Speaker, I'm hopeful that after this vote is taken, we can finally come to the reality that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, it's good for the American people, and we should get back to doing things that will advance prosperity in this great country. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise this morning to speak about an issue that is of great concern to my constituents back home in Pennsylvania, and it's the matter of the implementation of the President's Affordable Care Act. the implementation which some members of the President's party have described as a coming train wreck. Madam Chairman, that train wreck has arrived. This massive undertaking of enacting such a broad, confusing law has only highlighted the concerns that I and many of my constituents back home have had with this law and what it means for our small businesses and families in Pennsylvania. However, a new concern, possibly greater than the idea of government-run health care, has presented itself over the last several days with the revelation that the Internal Revenue Service has been targeting law-abiding Americans simply because of their beliefs. The IRS now wants to know what we think and what books we read. Madam Speaker, the President's health care law is largely a tax bill. It contains at least 20 new or higher taxes on American families and businesses. That makes it the biggest change to an already confusing tax code in over 2 decades. And with the implementation of this massive tax bill comes the IRS's new role in running it. By putting politics ahead of fairness, the IRS has violated the trust of the American people at a time when the administration is loading it up with more responsibility and more power. Under health care reform, the IRS will gather extensive information about the financial resources and health insurance status of all Americans. The expansion of the IRS's power will include hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes, the hiring of thousands of enforcement agents, and a tower of new rules and new regulations. I'm deeply concerned with the ability of the agency and the resolve of the agency to lawfully manage this significant undertaking with discretion and with accountability. While the agency reported that new rules are in place to assure that this type of situation never happens again, like many Americans, I question why this disturbing trend was ever allowed to happen in the first place. The President's health care law does too much to infringe on the rights of the American people and swells the size and the scope of an already bloated federal government, which has once again proven incapable of acting responsibly. Today, I urge members of Congress to fully repeal the health care law, and in doing so, taking the first step toward replacing it with common-sense solutions for all Americans, like allowing people to purchase coverage, health coverage, across state lines, stopping frivolous lawsuits against our doctors, clearing individuals to receive tax credits just like large businesses, and letting Americans keep control of the health care that works best for them. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to talk about the most fundamental right we as Americans have as citizens of this great country, the right to vote. The right to vote is not just fundamental, it is the right that preserves all of our other liberties that we as Americans hold dear. In fact, this right is so fundamental that most Americans understandably assume it is already enshrined in the Constitution. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, most Americans would be wrong. While the right to vote is inherent throughout our founding document, and there are amendments prohibiting discrimination, nothing in the Constitution explicitly guarantees our right to vote. We as Americans possess no affirmative right to vote. Why is this important? Because without a constitutional provision, courts have upheld burdensome registration requirements, voter identification laws, and reduced early voting opportunities in states across the country. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, just this year alone, more than 80 restrictive laws have been introduced in more than 30 states. From New York to Washington, legislation has been introduced that would require voters to show a photo ID. States from Virginia to New Mexico have considered bills that would make voter registration more difficult. And from Arizona to Tennessee, states have taken steps to limit early voting. Unfortunately, this plague of restrictive voting efforts has hit my state of Wisconsin as well. In 2011, our legislature passed a law that would limit the fundamental rights Wisconsin have to vote. Not only would this law require a photo ID, but it also took steps to disenfranchise senior citizens and college students, reduce registration opportunities, and restrict the ability of citizens to receive absentee ballots. But, Madam Speaker, Wisconsin has something that other states do not possess: a guaranteed right to vote. Article 3, Section 1 of the Wisconsin Constitution specifically states every United States citizen age 18 or older who is a resident of an election district in this state is a qualified elector of that district. This one sentence makes a huge difference for Wisconsinites. In two separate cases challenging the Wisconsin voter ID law, the Wisconsin Circuit Court has ruled that these restrictive, burdensome voting laws are unconstitutional because, and I quote from the decision in the NAACP of Milwaukee versus Walker, the Wisconsin Constitution expressly guarantees the right to vote. But this isn't enough. Not all states have this right. Our friends in Indiana, as we have seen, have little recourse if a restrictive voting law is signed into law. Now more than ever, we need to be protecting our right to vote, not restricting it. We need to reaffirm our founding principle that our country is at its strongest when everyone participates. We need to guarantee a right to vote for everyone. So this week, along with my friend and colleague, Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota, I introduced a right-to-vote amendment to the Constitution that will explicitly guarantee, without a doubt, the right of the American people to vote. The amendment is as simple as it is necessary. Every American citizen possesses the fundamental right to vote in every public election where they reside, and Congress has the right and power to protect it. No more will Americans have to prove their right to vote has been infringed. Instead, the burden of proof will be left to states to demonstrate that any efforts they take will not deny or abridge the fundamental right to vote. Now, I know there are some out there who will say the amendment to the Constitution is unrealistic. It's too hard to achieve. But those critics are short-sighted. This is about engaging my colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle and the American public in a movement to ensure our right to vote is not at the mercy of those acting with partisan motives. The right to vote is not a Democratic right, nor is it a Republican right. It is an American right, and it is fundamental to a government for the people, by the people. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to join on and protect our most fundamental right. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to pay tribute to one of America's most prominent African-American businessmen and financiers. Mr. Jacoby Dickens was born and grew up in Panama City, Florida, one of 6 children in a low-income family. The family moved to the south side of Chicago when Mr. Dickens was a teenager. He attended Wendell Phillips High School. After school, he worked as a building engineer, saved his money, and began investing in real estate. He eventually purchased and managed a large number of apartment buildings before selling them in 1971. After investing in several bowling alleys in the Chicago area, he was asked to join the board of Seaway Bank in 1979. In 1983, he became chairman of the board and remained until his death earlier this year. Under his guidance and leadership, Seaway Bank and Trust Company became the largest black-owned bank in Chicago, with assets of $547 million. Mr. Dickens was a great civic activist and contributor to public causes. He served on the boards of Chicago State University, the School of Business at Florida A&M University, and the Chicago Urban League. He donated more than $1 million to Chicago State University's Athletic Center, which bears his name. He was a trustee at the Museum of Science and Industry and DePaul University, where a scholarship and loan program is named for him. In the 1980s, he was a key supporter and fundraiser for Harold Washington, who was elected the first African-American mayor of Chicago. Jacoby Dickens was a man of vision, courage, and determination. He used his wisdom, business acumen, and money wisely, not only for himself and his family, but also for the uplifting of humanity. My condolences and well wishes go out to his wife, Miss Veranda Dickens, their family, and all of the trustees and employees of Seaway Bank and Trust Company. Mr. Dickens was indeed a man for the times and the seasons in which he lived. His bank gave loans in depressed communities and neighborhoods where people were hard-pressed to find resources. He will be sorely missed and always remembered. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the co-founder of the Congressional Out of Poverty Caucus and chair of the Democratic Whip Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity, I rise today to continue talking about the ongoing crisis of poverty and the impact of sequester. We are well aware of the impact of sequester. It's having on many, many communities across the country in terms of devastating some of the basic social safety network that we have all benefited from in many, many ways. They're really very, very harmful to our most vulnerable. Nearly 50 million Americans, including 16 million children all across our country and in every congressional district, are living in poverty. Yet the sequester continues to have devastating impacts on access to childhood education, affordable housing, hot meals for low-income seniors, Head Start, and countless other programs that help low-income and vulnerable Americans. But, Madam Speaker, these draconian cuts are not enough for some of my colleagues, given what took place last night at the Ag Committee. Last night, the Ag Committee passed a $20 billion cut to our nation's first line of defense against hunger in the Farm Bill. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as the Food Stamp Program, is really a vital lifeline for millions of Americans. Now, as a young single mother, I relied on food stamps and public assistance during a very difficult period in my life. Let me tell you, no one wants to be on food stamps. But it is a bridge over troubled water. And so I am quite frankly appalled and very sad to see my colleagues attacking the integrity of such essential programs for families that need a helping hand during difficult times. As we work to create, hopefully, a balanced reauthorization of the Farm Bill, we must keep in mind the people, the families, and businesses impacted by these proposed cuts. Nearly half of all SNAP recipients are children. 1 in 5 children in America are at risk of hunger, and we know that nearly half of all children in America will be on SNAP benefits sometime during their childhood. That's half of all children in America. Not only does SNAP help put food on the table for struggling families, every $1 increase in SNAP benefits generates $1.70 in economic activity. Yet if the Farm Bill becomes law, more than 2 million families will be cut off from this economic lifeline. With unemployment still at 7.5%, and in some communities it's over 13%, and the rate of poverty at 15%, again, some communities it's 27 to 30%, ongoing cuts to SNAP and other nutrition assistance programs will increase hunger in America, and we will see even greater consequences. Hungry children cannot learn in schools and suffer developmental delays. Hungry children have worse health outcomes. Hungry children have bleaker economic outlooks through the rest of their adult lives. But the impacts don't stop there. Cuts to critical nutrition programs don't just hurt the hungry families who rely on them. They hurt the economies of local communities as families have less money to spend in local stores. Allowing an increase in hunger across America will threaten our nation's ability to develop highly skilled and highly educated workforce that we will need to compete in the 21st century. We must not make cuts on the backs of hungry children to balance our budgets. Doing so would be morally wrong and an economic disaster. Madam Speaker, instead of scheduling a 37th vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act, we should come together to work to find an approach for all Americans to help get everyone back to work. We need a comprehensive solution to replace the sequester and to address the ongoing crisis of poverty. That is why, with the support of our Democratic caucus, we started a task force on poverty and opportunity in February, which I am proud to chair. We are working to build support for a comprehensive national strategy to help eliminate poverty, grow the economy, and create millions of new jobs, and I urge all of my colleagues to join us. I also hope that our colleagues will join myself, Representatives Jim McGovern, our Congressional Black Caucus Chair Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and our Democratic Caucus Vice Chair Joe Crowley in taking the food stamp challenge. We need to raise the level of awareness of what is taking place here in Washington, D.C. And so what we're going to do is commit ourselves to limiting our food budget to the average SNAP benefit for a week. That's $1.40 per person per meal. We will show how vital it is to strengthen and fully fund SNAP, and we're asking all of those who can do this to join with this. We've got to protect the most vulnerable, grow the economy, and SNAP is one of the best programs to do just that. So it's time not to slash it, but to support it.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House is in a recess now, back at noon Eastern, to begin debate on a bill that would repeal the 2010 health care law. CQ writes about it, saying that after scuttling a vote on a bill last month that would have extended part of the 2010 health care law, House Republican leaders today will hold the chamber's third vote on legislation that would repeal the entire statute. Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota is sponsoring the bill. Live coverage of the House when they return. Over on C-SPAN 3 right now, the Senate Judiciary Committee continues consideration of over 300 amendments to the Gang of Eight Border Immigration and Border Security Bill. The committee will finish up